Hey, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. I had a very different experience than most gamers, I think, in 2022. So if you're expecting me to join the chorus saying that last year was fairly empty and disappointing in terms of new games, or be one more person to put Horizon Forbidden West, God of War Ragnarok, and Elden Ring on my Games of the Year list, don't bet on it. As is traditional, I'm going to share games that I most enjoyed playing, or that I most enjoyed in 2022, starting with my top 3 games released last year, and then the top 3 I enjoyed last year that were released before 2022, keeping these lists nice and small so I can really just talk about the experiences I really and truly enjoyed. Okay, so starting with my top 3 games released in 2022, number 3 is Saints Row 2022. As I said in my review of Saints Row, I recognize that this game has problems and it has shortcomings, especially at launch. But no matter how much I hear people jumping on the hate wagon for this one, I got exactly what I wanted from Saints Row 2022, a casual, open city sandbox with a bunch to do and collect, largely involving collecting and racing around in vehicles and shooting up mobs of stupid enemies. I was not expecting Grand Theft Auto or some big evolution of the Saints Row series. I'm really glad that I didn't get Grand Theft Auto. I have issues with the design choices in that game. It's not my thing. Saints Row, to me, is a very particular combination of elements that I don't need them to deviate from. And while even for my tastes, there are a few remaining shortcomings, I'm happy to stand with the small minority of the online discourse and say that I really enjoy Saints Row 2022. Next up in the number 2 spot is Elix 2. Now, the original Elix, once I found the right mindset with which to appreciate it, was a game that caught me off guard as it skyrocketed onto the list of my all-time favorite games. Elix 2, without the advantage of being an entirely fresh experience, still retained all the essential issues of what I loved in the first game. Essential Issues is the name of my comic book review series. All right, I just wrote this, and this is my first time running through this. Anyway, it still retained all the essentials of that first game, brought them back, polished up a few things, but I mean, that wasn't something I was counting on. You know, it's this Thundar the Barbarian-like post-apocalyptic setting that throws magic into the mix of its third-person open-world setting. It's an action RPG with emphasis on RPG. I'm just amazed at what games people consider action RPGs that I'm like, no, Elden Ring. And so there's an emphasis here on RPG, both in terms of character and world interactions, the systems that have you interacting with the world in which you find there. There are fascinating characters with interesting dialogue and strong voice acting that overcomes the wooden facial animations to help create a world I was always interested to try and earn my place in. And you really have to earn your place in Elix 2 as well as the first game. The diverse choices and outcomes in the quests, the grotesque and intimidating enemies, and the satisfaction found in looting and building up my character from almost helpless to practically dominant. All those things came together and gave me an experience that still stands out from every other RPG series I've tried over the years. Although it lacks some polish that betrays its AA budget and origins, I will gladly accept some clunkiness here and there in exchange for the boldness that a small developer like this can afford to have in some of their design choices that a AAA developer just can't do. They just have to play it safe because of all the money that's gone into this and that they need to make back, you know. So if you feel the same way and you love Western RPGs and haven't played Elix 1 or 2, then I highly recommend you do some research to see if these games might be for you. Don't get reviews of these games from the big outlets. Find the folks who really love and focus on RPGs, who give you a deep dive into their thoughts, and through them learn more about what's really important about Elix 1 and 2, and see if this series might be for you, because Elix 2, man, that was my number 2 new game of 2022. And number 1 among my new games released last year, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. I finished Pathfinder Kingmaker last year, and I should say both of these are the PlayStation 4 versions. But I finished Pathfinder Kingmaker last year after finding some tips and tricks to deal with a few considerable technical problems, and by the end I was in love with that game all over again. It was my number 2 game the year that it came out, and I was ready for Wrath of the Righteous when it came out last year. So I was ready so much, in fact, that I even played some of the original Baldur's Gate just to scratch that itch while I waited. For those who don't know, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is based on the tabletop RPG that came out of the rules and aesthetics of classic Dungeons and Dragons. It uses a gameplay system inspired by the real-time with pause style of RPGs like Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, Dragon Age Origins, and Pillars of Eternity, although you can choose to play it in turn-based mode if you want. I definitely do not. The numerous difficulty sliders and other gameplay adjustments allow me to truly tweak Wrath of the Righteous into the game experience that I want, namely one in which I oversee my party in combat, giving specific commands now and then when I feel like it's needed, rather than micromanaging every detail, as in a game like Divinity Original Sin and many other turn-based Western RPGs. I've seen some big AAA games get praise for diverse choices in dialogue and in questing, but they still usually don't come close to games like this, who, partly because of their budget, but I think also partly from a design choice, just abandon any attempt to voice every line of dialogue in exchange for giving you far more choices in dialogue, far more role-playing and personality options. The classic alignment system is the basis for a wide variety of options in dialogue that allow me to play a nuanced character that is far more complex than a mere 3 response options will allow for. And the variety of character classes, the variety within each class as you upgrade, and the option to mix and match skills between classes really allows me to create my own unique character with facets of personality most RPGs will never anticipate and allow for. And of course, there's also very rich variety in monsters and in loot, with that classic overlay of the D&D visual aesthetic that I just never get tired of. And it also includes an epic orchestral and choral score that I'm almost positive I will be purchasing for my fantasy tabletop gaming sessions. The D&D inspired real-time with pause isometric fantasy RPG, if you can say that in one breath, is a particular recipe that I think you'll probably either just like or you won't. If you've never played this kind of game before, I think Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is a solid entry point, largely because of how easily you can really adjust the difficulty parameters to make the game what you want it to be, as easy as you want it to be. You know, if you want, you can slowly get to know its admittedly deep RPG systems at your own pace, or at the end of the day, hardly at all, if you'd rather just set everything to easiest and breeze through combat while you enjoy the settings and the creature designs and the story. You can totally do that. This one was neck and neck with Elix 2 until the very end of my decision making. It's a bit like comparing apples and oranges, and I found really that I enjoyed both of them equally for different reasons. In fact, I found both Elix 2 and Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous to be significantly more enjoyable experiences than most of my number 1 games from the last 5 years. But in the end, I finished Elix 2 in about 65 hours, nice, beefy, meaty RPG, and having just recently passed 65 hours in Wrath of the Righteous, it's clear that this game still has many, many hours of content that I am certainly still hungry for. And so on that basis, it edges out the win, and I'm calling Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous my favorite game released in 2022. All right, and now my top 3 legacy games of 2022, including first, at number 3, For Against Darkness, the only non-video game on my list this year. This streamlined, turn-based dungeon crawl with an old-school aesthetic strips away tactical positioning and other ultimately unnecessary elements to mimic at the tabletop an experience something like, I think, the early Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy video games, where the dungeon crawl is less about tactical choices in combat and more about pressing your luck with limited resources, deciding whether or not it's time to turn back and heal up in town, or press further and deeper into the dungeon with the spells and supplies that you still have remaining. I did not end up producing a review for this game. I thought I might, but I didn't, in part because it kind of keeps changing. The base rules are very inexpensive, and numerous modular books can be purchased to further customize or flesh out your experience. And I acquired books like that in stages throughout 2022. While you can certainly find reviews of the game on YouTube, I think the best way to get a handle on it might be to just see it played. Last year, I started a solo tabletop campaign of 4 Against Darkness, and I live streamed it, releasing weekly episodes of my adventures that you can check out on the Christian Geek Central YouTube channel, and I plan to continue that series very soon this year. So if the basic sound of this game interests you, I invite you to check out those videos and see if 4 Against Darkness might be a game that you would enjoy at your tabletop as well. Number 2, Elmanage Original. This one, in recent years, I've come to appreciate the turn-based, grid-based, just the dungeons, ma'am, fantasy RPGs inspired by the Wizardry series. And in 2022, I finally finished what for me is currently the cream of the crop in Elmanage Original. I have to say that the PSP version that I played via the PlayStation TV much of the time has some jaggy sprites, so if you're cool with PC, I would play it there. It looks much better on PC. The translation from Japanese is also rough, to say the least. I really had to scratch my head a number of times to figure out some gameplay elements, and now and then there'll be a word that they just didn't get around to translating. It just has the original Japanese characters, and I'm like, what the crap happened there? But making my way through grid-based dungeons while clearing the fog of war and encountering this vast variety of D&D inspired creatures with a party of classic D&D inspired character classes. I mean, it's special to have all those elements together, I think. You can find other games like this, inspired by Wizardry in some way, especially coming out of Asian countries, I've noticed, but they usually change the focus to Pokemon-like monster acquisition, or use a cheery anime art style, or they use real-time combat instead of turn-based, or something else that just veers off the very specific path that I want this game type to stay on. So as with a number of things that I review and talk about, my enjoyment is ultimately less about the polish and other evidence of budget, and more about whether or not it matches my very specific, very choosy tastes. And that might mean that it's just not the right game for you at all. But as of finishing in the game in 2022, I would definitely call Elmanage Original one of my favorite games of all time now. And at number 1 in my legacy games of last year, Elix, the original Elix, even more easily one of my all-time favorites now. I reviewed this game based on 5 hours of play when it released in 2017, and even put 10 more hours into it after that, only to just give up on it. I was like, this is not my kind of game. I just can't extract fun from this. But years later, after having my tastes stretched and shaped by Monster Hunter World, and trying the first few hours of Elix 2 and being reminded, man, this world looks so interesting. I just want to get in there and get to know it and explore it. I decided to come back to the original Elix, and I discovered that I was now perfectly calibrated to appreciate what this game has to offer. I've said many times that I don't play games for challenge, and that's largely true when the challenge is based on quick thinking, fast reflexes, patiently learning enemy patterns, those kinds of action game type things that I'm just never going to really have in my DNA what is needed to excel at them. But if I can instead leverage other options, other game mechanics to more slowly and easily grind for XP or gold, for instance, I find it extremely gratifying in those cases to make my way from zero to hero in an RPG. Elix exemplifies that journey more than any game I've played. Once I realized that you're really not expected to engage in combat much in the opening hours of the game, but rather find non-combat side quests to earn XP and resources while becoming familiar with the world and its people, my attitude then radically changed. I felt smart and clever for the various ways I found to finish quests without taking the obvious and much harder path. The shortcomings in facial and combat animations fell into the background background for me as I enjoyed the writing, the unique setting, and the feeling of constantly getting closer to that next upgrade that will get me further down the road toward coming back and destroying that giant enemy that I've had to run in terror from for the last dozen hours. Now, to say much more about Elix would just involve, I think, repeating what I said about Elix 2, so I'll just wrap up by saying that Elix is in that special category of game for me, like BioShock, like Monster Hunter, that I not only found I loved, but that introduced me to a whole new category of game I'd assumed I would never be able to enjoy. Elix is one of the most memorable and captivating RPG experiences I've ever had, and is now easily among my favorite games of all time. Finally, I have to give, as I do each year to one game, the most thought-provoking game of 2022 to Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, with a backdrop involving a holy crusade against a race of demons. Numerous characters have religious backgrounds of different kinds that, while invented, of course, for a fantasy world, have echoes inspired by real-world beliefs and worldviews. And so it's very common for issues of right and wrong, of philosophy and God to come to mind as I try to sort through the decisions my character has to make, while also sorting through the intentional or unintentional commentary on real-world religious beliefs that is being made by the writers. D&D-inspired fantasy worlds often have elements of religion at play, but Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous nearly makes them central to the main plot, with frequent nuggets worth thinking about and critically evaluating. All right, well, 2022 was one of the richest years in my gaming hobby in a long time, with multiple great game experiences in two big genres I already loved, exemplified by Elminage Original and Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, along with a new type of game I discovered I love in Elix 1 and 2, not to mention the persistent recurring fun I still extracted from Monster Hunter World. I'd love to hear about the games that you most enjoyed last year in the comments below. They're probably pretty different from mine, and so I would be interested to hear what you have to say. Then, as always, I hope you'll check out the Christian Geek Central podcast and stay connected to all CGC content over at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.